Anytime a player has been so influential and dominant for a long time, the NBA usually considers changing the rules. But it usually goes both ways. Sometimes they don't want the NBA to move towards a certain direction, so they implement rules to stop a certain player or certain playstyle from dominating. For example, the 5-second back to the basket rule was implemented because Charles Barkley would post people up and back them down for the entire shot clock. And it wasn't fun to watch. The defensive 3-second violation was implemented in 2001. It allowed perimeter players an easier time penetrating the paint, since big guys could no longer stand around near the basket unless he was within arm's reach of another player. This limited the impact big men had on defense. But of course, when we talk about major rule changes that change the way basketball is played, look no further than Michael Jordan. In his time, he spawned the creation of 3 new rules that still have a drastic impact on the NBA landscape today. Let's talk about them. How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and let's get started. The flagrant foul. If you're an NBA fan, you've probably watched Michael Jordan highlights at some point in your life. If so, you've also probably seen his highlights against the Detroit Pistons, the team that knocked the Bulls out of the playoffs for 3 consecutive years. Those series have been heavily examined over the decades, with an entire book written on how the Pistons defended Jordan. The defining factor was how physical they were. Every time Jordan would drive into the paint, he'd see at least 3 defenders. If they couldn't stop him, then foul him as hard as possible. It wasn't just these matchups in particular. Throughout the 1980s, the NBA has gotten more and more physical, to the point where brawls and fights were a very common occurrence. Not only was the physicality starting to get dangerous, but it was making the NBA less marketable as a sport to a wider audience. David Stern's goal was to make basketball a worldwide phenomenon, and in order to do that, he had to clean up the game to make it family-friendly. These games between the Pistons and Bulls were the breaking point. Jordan was getting hacked like crazy from everybody, especially Bill Laimbeer. The idea was, if you were gonna foul him, then foul him hard, cause it's only 2 free throws either way. The Bulls even sent numerous letters to the NBA office suggesting that the Pistons were playing dirty. They were purposely targeting MJ with these overtly hard fouls, which it turned out to be true as they admitted it years later. This whole conversation went back and forth a bit, with the Pistons accusing the refs of favoring MJ, calling fouls if somebody breathed on him. So that's why they would hit him hard, to, quote, level the playing field. Eventually, a new rule would be implemented. In 1991, the NBA implemented the flagrant foul. When the refs deem excessive and unnecessary contact is committed by a player, then the recipient will be awarded 2 free throws and possession of the ball. The point of this rule was to deter players from making excessive contact when fouling another player. This way, players would have more incentive to play the game cleanly. Since the flagrant foul rule was implemented, there's been opposing voices from both sides on whether or not this was good or bad for the league. On one hand, it definitely toned down the number of hard fouls starting in the 90s and up until now, and it's generally better in preventing unnecessary injuries, and it turned the NBA into a more marketable product. I mean, I know fights are cool and all, but you don't want to see them all the time. On the other hand, people have argued that the NBA is too soft now, and the fewer hard fouls have made the game less intense. That's why a lot of old heads say things like, oh, Steph Curry, he would never last in the 80s or 90s. Though I doubt they're right. However, Stern's initial response to those critics was that, while basketball is a physical sport, the flagrant rule is supposed to encourage the finesse and beauty of the sport, so that players can play freely without worrying about getting knocked unconscious. Overall, I'd say it worked out well. The hand-checking ban. While hand-checking was originally banned in the 1970s, the ban was hardly enforced until much later. This came in 1995 during Michael Jordan's first retirement. Defenders were not allowed to use their hands to impede the movement of an offensive player, or else a foul will be called. You must stay in front of them and move your feet. Around the same time, also during MJ's retirement, the NBA shortened the three-point line and made it closer. Rod Thorne, the NBA's VP of operations, stated his reasoning for this. Scoring in this league has gone down for something like 10 straight years. Teams are not taking as many shots, they're holding the ball more. If you have a sport, you like to have some action. You don't want it to become a grappling match. Due to the brief retirement of Jordan, the article further added on, with Michael Jordan retired and more teams emulating Pat Riley's borderline violent New York Knicks, the NBA desperately wanted to change the style of basketball being played. The ban of hand-checking is supposed to promote perimeter scoring and allow smaller guys an easier time to create exciting plays off the dribble. Essentially, the NBA wanted to recreate what Jordan has been doing for so long. They wanted more players to play like him, not like Patrick Ewing, or like other rugged big men who spend 15 seconds posting up. So when Jordan came back, he picked up right where he left off, and the Bulls registered the greatest season in NBA history. These new changes drew controversy as well. While the three-point line would eventually return back to its normal distance, the ban of hand-checking was believed to have given too much power to the guards. Jordan was already impossible to defend, but now you don't even allow defenders to touch him? Nobody could stop the Bulls now. A few years down the road, Wilt Chamberlain and Michael Jordan talked for a little bit, and Wilt looked him straight in the eye and told him an eye-opening statement. Just remember, Michael, when you played, they changed the rules to make it easier for you to dominate. When I played, they changed the rules to make it harder for me. Jordan had no comeback. Anyway, in the long run, this rule, like what Rod Thorne predicted, definitely had a drastic impact on how the game is played today. By the 2000s and later, we saw the rise of guards and wing players, who now had a much easier time blowing by the defense and penetrating the paint. There's a reason the NBA turned into a guard-dominated league. For a long time, centers and bigs were a dime a dozen, despite dominating the NBA for much of its history. Considering the NBA also boomed in popularity during this same time period, perhaps this rule change was for the better. The max contract. Remember how back in the day, Jordan had a few years where he made literally more money than the entire salary cap? It's because up until 1999, there was no limit to how much a player could be paid. If a team was under the cap, they can exceed the cap to offer however much money they wanted to. Back then, the Bulls offered Jordan $33 million a year when the salary cap was $24 million, which makes the Bulls' payroll look just comically ridiculous. He was making almost 10 times more than the next highest paid player on his own team. There were other issues with how contracts worked as well, such as Scottie Pippen being incredibly underpaid for a long time and not being able to renegotiate. Or Magic Johnson signing a 25-year contract in 1981. Or Kevin Garnett's unparalleled $126 million contract in 1997. All of these issues piled up and eventually led to the 1999 lockout. However, the thing with Jordan's contract is that it was problematic in more ways than one. The Bulls offered him the money, but everyone knew Jordan was still worth far more to the organization than $33 million. I mean, the dude is basically a money-making machine. So it really did not hurt the Bulls at all to offer him that. Like, imagine if the Cavs offered LeBron $100 million a year. That's still a great deal considering how much revenue he generates for the team. He's probably worth a lot more than that. But the problem was, back then, there was no luxury tax either. You can go over the cap all you want with no penalty. This would be addressed in the 1999 lockout, which created a cap for how much money a player could be offered. Usually 25%, 30%, or 35% of the cap, depending how long they've been in the NBA. It also added a new luxury tax, which penalized teams for going over the cap. In the long run, this made it harder for teams to stick with the same players, because eventually, young players want to be paid more, but teams aren't willing to go over the cap because of the tax. While this change did not have any impact on the court, it changed the direction and thought process of the NBA front offices. For example, here's an interesting stat. From 1988 to 1998, only one reigning All-NBA star signed with another team in free agency. That was Shaquille O'Neal. No other stars did that because it was much easier to re-sign them without difficulty. Nowadays, it seems like star players bounce around so many teams. There's more player movement than ever before simply because it's hard to keep the same roster when it's time for guys to get paid. The luxury tax was a huge game changer. Anyway, those were 3 rule changes that Michael Jordan either directly or indirectly caused. Do you think all of them were necessary? Do you think the NBA would be better off if they did not implement some of them? I feel like, they all improved the league generally as a whole. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. That's all, folks. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed the video, and of course, as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.